to please return either this evening or in the week coming, or weeks coming, to enjoy the exhibition further. The exhibition goes on until the 30th of January 2026, so there's plenty of time for you to really savor and enjoy that exhibition. So without much further delay, I would like to very much introduce Lieutenant Colonel Atheline Branch, the retired former head of the Barbados Defence Force, Chief of Staff, who will be our moderator this evening, and our panelists, and she will introduce our panelists as well. So please, a round of applause for Lieutenant Colonel Branch. And sorry, just one piece of housekeeping to the panelists. The clicker there is on the table. So those who are doing a PowerPoint presentation, you can use the clicker. I will assist Mr. Callender. Thank you. Okay, understood. Lieutenant Colonel.
Well, thank you all very much. Mr. Pena has given me a promotion. I was not the head of the Defense Force. I was a Deputy Chief of Staff. So let's make sure that we have everything in correct order before I'm court-martialed, even though I'm retired. But I'm very happy to be here, particularly as a former and retired military person. You know, all military people are very interested in hearing about the history of the wars. And we have 6 very distinguished people this evening who will talk to us and share what they have researched in terms of the World War I. So each person will have about 10 minutes. Please, I'm going to be there clocking you. I'm sitting up front so you can see me, no excuses. So just about 10 minutes per person. And so we'll be here for about an hour listening to them, and then immediately after that, we will have the questions. So keep your questions till the end and make your notes, and we will have that after the last person has given their presentation. I will just let you know who the panelists are, and afterwards, before each one presents, I would tell you a little bit more about them. So on my far left, we have Dr. Jeffrey Ward. Next to him is Miss Michelle Hinkson Cox. Next to her is Dr. Cleve Scott. Then Professor Stefan Mans. Lieutenant Commander Fernella Cordell. And Mr. Pat Callender. Okay. So our first presenter this evening is Dr. Jeffrey Ward, who would have completed his undergraduate degree in history at the University of Western Ontario in Canada before he returned right here to Barbados. He was awarded his PhD from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, in 2022. And I knew him when he was doing that, just as he was finishing that. He is currently an RLC, University of the West Indies postdoctoral fellow, investigating Barbados's rum exports between 1775 and 1820. I really must have another word with Dr. Ward, especially when it comes to rum. This evening, he will be concentrating more on the perspective into the role of the Caribbean played in providing material. So he's not going to speak so much about personnel, but more about the material. So he's going to look at the Caribbean in the context of World War and focus on providing the material. So Dr. Jeff Ward, over to you.
Good evening. Thank you all very much. Not to disrupt things a little bit, Colonel Branch, but I was having a wonderfully long series of thoughts on what would be good to discuss the Caribbean maritime space and the First World War. And what I really would like us today is Remembrance Sunday. Remembrance Day is next week. And there's an old but true adage, those who forget history are bound to repeat it. And I would like to go on that. We're going to touch on a couple of things just to let you know. The first is operational. The second will be a bit more geopolitical in the Caribbean. And then hopefully we can have some questions at the end of it. Now, one of the things that I like to think of the Caribbean, and indeed the world in the First World War, is a world in transition. And nowhere can we see that more than the technology that is used in this time. Just having a quick time check, ma'am. That's used in this time. And we are right on the edge. We haven't quite, the world hasn't seen the technology yet to allow for large-scale naval endeavors like we would see in the Second World War. But we are right on the edge. And there's a vessel, a German frigate, named the Karlsruhe. Hopefully I haven't butchered it too badly. Excellent. That's the last time I will say that tonight, so one to. The cruiser itself, the technology it represented, and the type of that waged very briefly in the Caribbean, of what is going on technologically. Now, again, a little bit of technology here for you. The cruiser was powered. It was powered by both coal and oil. Coal was the fuel of choice of the late 19th century. Fuel oil would be the fuel of choice of the 20th century. This had both. But it only had a range of 5,000 nautical miles. Now, that might not mean a lot, but if you're coming from the North Sea to Barbados, that's 4,000 nautical miles. The age of coal, the vessels were not very efficient at all, and they needed a large amount of infrastructure, which was not available at the time, particularly with how quickly the war came about. That being said, the cruiser traveled up and down the coast of South America, from Brazil to Argentina, from essentially August 1814 till its eventual destruction on the 4th of November 1814. And in that time, it captured or sank 15 English ships, 1 Dutch ship, and around 72,000 gross registered tons. Essentially, it was a very effective pocket battleship along the lines of the Graf Spee in the Second World War, which most people know about. And it really was the precursor of that commerce war in South America and the Caribbean. Now, the Karlsruhe, sorry, I said it again, actually left. It was being chased by 11 British cruisers. That's 11 to 1. And it thought the coast of the eastern seaboard of South America was a little bit too hot and heavy. So what it did is it decided to sail for Barbados. It was going to attack Barbados, use some of the coal that was stored in Barbados. Not a major coaling station at the time. There was a dock, an open roadstead, and vessels of about 14 feet draft could reach that jetty to unload the coal. So it was a very inefficient way of putting coal on lighters and refueling the ship. Trinidad had a much better infrastructure built by the British, where the ships could go right alongside a massive coal jetty. But Trinidad was very well defended, Barbados was not. And they had planned to go from shelling Barbados and waging commerce warfare here, bunkering the ship with the coal, and then head into Martinique to seriously wage war against Martinique, Dominique, and Guadeloupe. Now, on 4th of November, 1914, we can best estimate the cruiser was about 200 miles to the east of Trinidad when a major internal explosion occurred, and the ship sank in and of itself. The Kriegsmarine at the time, knowing that 11 British cruisers were in the region trying to find their one ship, kept this a secret, and the British only found out in May of 2015. So it took up a massive amount of British naval resource. Many people do talk about the U-boat war in the Caribbean, but this is, as I said earlier, this is mainly a World War II phenomenon. there were very few submarines, because the fuel oil, the diesel technology was so new, that could make the journey. And most of those vessels were employed in the North Sea. A few went across to America, but not many came to the Caribbean. That is not to say, however, that there was a significant amount of amphibious warfare in the Caribbean. And I'd like to read a small passage here. I'm taking it from a friend's thesis, and he wrote on the Navy, the British Navy, and what they faced in the First World War. And he says, in 1900, Imperial Britain was faced by the specter of rising continental power that took the conscious decision to convert the remarkable latent power of its rapidly expanding industrial economy into the hard power of a modern battle fleet navy, and in doing so mount an increasingly explicit challenge to the preeminence of Britain's own naval supremacy. This rising power had previously contented itself by directing its energies on continental expansion and unification through war. By 1900, it had obtained the beginnings of an overseas empire, increasingly exerted its influence to weigh in the imperial and commercial disputes of the European great powers, and whose leaders were iconoclast, hypermasculine, deeply influenced by the thinking of naval strategist Mahan, and personally committed to the building of a battle fleet. This might very well be describing Wilhelm II of Germany of the Second Reich, but it equally applies to Theodore Roosevelt and the United States in the Progressive era. And this is the second point in my last few minutes here that I want to touch on. Many people have not covered American imperial expansion in the Caribbean in the First World War. They conducted a number of successful amphibious operations in the region to take over governments and topple regimes. There are a few I would like to mention to you very quickly. The Dominican Republic in 1907, and the U.S. signed a treaty reserving the U.S. reserved the right to intervene in order to protect its customs receivership. When Woodrow Wilson wanted to expand this, the Dominican Republic, the government said no. And in 1916, U.S. Marines landed in Santo Domingo and set up an establishment, a U.S. military government. Then they supervised what governments, in serious quotations, from there on in. The U.S. supervision of governments in the Dominican Republic lasted until 1924. And the U.S. retained control over the customs revenues of the Dominican Republic until 1941. In Haiti, German firms made serious inroads starting in the mid-19th century, so around 1850 onwards. By the start of the First World War in 1914, estimates are that they controlled up to 80% of the internal trade and key infrastructure on the island. This did not fit with American imperial Caribbean designs. So in 1915, a small force of U.S. Marines landed in Port-au-Prince and established a U.S. supervised government, which lasted until 1934. Cuba, it was considered the actions taken in 1917, which lasted to 1922, were considered the third invasion of Cuba. The first one in 1898 and the second one in 1906. And this is all part of a policy that was put on by Theodore Roosevelt. It was an extension of the Monroe Doctrine, which warned European powers not to enter into the Caribbean and interfere in what they considered American imperial waters. Well, Theodore Roosevelt took it a step further, and he said that the U.S. reserved the right to actively interfere in the Caribbean and South America, even if it is against illegal European interest to protect their their economic investments in the region. I think I'm about right on time here. I have about 30 seconds to go, which isn't too bad. So in summary, the Caribbean was a very volatile geopolitical space, as it once again is today. And there are precedents similar to for what is happening now at the turn of the 20th century. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Ward, you just did that in a true military fashion. 10 minutes on the dot.
Perfect.
Our next panelist, Ms. Michelle Hinkson-Cox, has been involved in the performing arts for over 30 years. She is a playwright, a poet, producer, director, theater educator, and published researcher. And most recently, she served as the artistic director for Carifesta 15 in Barbados. We know that was really a good Carifesta. She has worked extensively with the Barbados Museum and Historical Society to develop immersive museum theater projects, focusing on using oral and written narratives to create new plays that highlight Barbadian history and intangible cultural heritage. She is a recipient of a full scholarship from the Scottish Graduate School for the Arts and Humanities, through which she is pursuing her PhD. We wish you all success. Focusing on playwriting as a tool for exploring difficult historical narratives. Ms. Hinkson-Cox this evening will speak on theater as an access point for addressing difficult histories. The process of theater is one which creates a safe space for exploring themes that may be otherwise difficult to discuss. In other words, picture speaks volumes. The art form can create a distancing that allows both actors and audience to ask critical questions about what is being presented. She's also going to speak about the ethical considerations when using theater for historical representations. In representing historical narratives and the lived experiences of real people, what are some of the considerations that theater practitioners need to bear in mind to ensure that the representations are fair and balanced, as well as a few more questions which she will speak to this evening. Please.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I suppose I'm somewhat the outlier on this panel because I'm not a historian, and I'm not one who is particularly versed in the details of World War I. But I encountered this topic some 3 years ago, Stefan, when Behind the Wire first came to Barbados. And Professor Mans and I, we co-facilitated a workshop with some of my students from Barbados Community College. And what we did was an applied theater intervention, and that's what I'm going to be speaking to today. Because with applied theater, what happens is that it's a type of theater that is not the conventional. So it's not what you're accustomed to going and, you watch something on stage, you have a good laugh or not, you clap at the end and you go home. Applied theater focuses a lot more on the process than the actual product. So it looks at how are we creating this work of art. Sometimes there is no product depending on what your theme is. So with all of this focus on the process, what I'm looking at is how do we make sure that our process is ethical, particularly when you're representing these types of histories that are potentially difficult conversations to have. Now, we're talking about World War I here. My research really is on the transatlantic slave trade, so you can understand the kind of ethical questions that would come up within that context. But one of the other things about applied theater is that it encourages both participant and audience interaction. So you're not just coming to be passively involved in the creation of the play or in the watching of the play at the end. So even the actors are asked to engage. Yeah? So you can imagine you're on stage and you're talking about a particular topic, but you're also being asked to share what are your thoughts on that topic. How do you interact with it? What are the problems that you may face as an actor? and then you bring that to the audience and you're asking them the same questions. So it's allowing that kind of inquiry into the process. We allow for co-production of meaning, so it is not a dictatorial space where the director stands up and tells you what to do. You're encouraged as an actor to bring into the space as well and to be a part of the production of meaning. But what's most important is that it's a safe space for exploration. So when you have difficult topics like this one, I think when we did the workshop a few years ago, the students came in, most of them really having no idea about any of the world wars. They didn't know that there were Germans who were interred here. I didn't know that either. We had quite a bit of a learning experience with Stefan and just being able to interact with the exhibition. So what we did is that we went through the exhibition panel by panel. The students were allowed to identify what speaks to them from those panels. So you're no longer just looking at the exhibition as a work of art, but it's a learning process as well. What do you want to know more about? What are the stories that stick out to you within that exhibition? The easy ones, I think, were recognizing that there were, performers within the prison system. So you had quite a number of the interred soldiers actually becoming performers within that space because they had to find a way to entertain themselves. So that's kind of the easy part of the history. But what was particularly beautiful about that experience was that two of our students came back and said, we want to write a full play based on Behind the Wire. And that meant that the research had to go much deeper than what they would have done just in I think it was a 3-hour workshop that we had. So they had to do a significant amount of work. And one of the main things that we spoke to was how are we representing these people who, number one, we don't know. We have no knowledge of, personal knowledge, who they are. We can't go and speak to them one-on-one. But you're also representing people from a culture that doesn't quite sit familiar with us here in Barbados. Much of them, they never even thought of German accents. We had a fun time trying to learn the German accent to then represent it to an audience as authentically as possible. But it was that space where we were able to explore safely. One of the things about the applied theater practice as well is that it is not just co-creation in terms of the space, but also being able to work along with partners. So the Barbados Museum and Historical Society being one of our primary partners at the college, but also being able to liaise with Professor Mans, being able to have those conversations with others who are involved in the history and who can teach from that perspective. So you really get kind of a cross-disciplinary production that's happening at the end of it. Now, I want to talk about a particular theorist who I think is especially relevant within this context of discussing World War I and theater. And I usually like when Professor Mans calls his name because he does it a lot better than I do in German. Bertolt. Yeah. We have to get Professor Mans' mic on for that, but Bertolt Brecht. I try to say it like him, but it never really quite works out. Brecht was born in Germany in 1898, and he actually studied medicine originally. And he was serving in World War I in the Army hospital. He was not a happy guy. He saw a lot of, obviously, trauma, very bloody atmosphere. He talks a lot about what he saw in that space and how it affected him. And he was particularly anti-war. So he came out of the hospital. He said he could not support the horrors that he had seen there during the war. He spoke out about the Nazis. He was also exiled from Germany at one point. And he was particularly angry about how society would have experienced the war and the effect of the war on the society where he was living. He had a particular interest in Marxism as well. And, he really was quite interested in looking at even artistic expressionism. So those things would have informed his own philosophy. And what Brecht did is that he used theater to address the ills that he was seeing in the war at the time. He didn't want the catharsis that, was familiar to theater goers back then. You go to the theater, you have a lovely time, you clap, you go home and you feel relieved or whatever. He wanted his audience to go home and think. He wanted you to come to the theater to think. He wanted you to be critical, to think about what is causing this particular situation? And beyond that, what can I do to make a change socially, politically, personally? So he didn't want you to be lost in the magic of theater. It was about intellectualizing what you were seeing and having an opinion. So he did ask his audience to think, what causes this injustice that now creates this thing that we call war, and what can we do to change it? He developed a particular type of theater called epic theater, which focused on the inquiry, on the argument, not on just the suspense and the immersion of traditional theater. And he made sure that his audience and his actors kept a critical distance. So, you know, we watch a play or we watch a movie and we think, oh my goodness, that actor really embodied the character. And Brecht is saying, no, we don't want you to embody anything. So even as the actor, your character could be, you know, the most fantastic character out there, but as the actor, you were allowed to show how you felt about that character. So it was really quite an interesting and a new way of working in theater during that period of time, because it was not something that was a norm. It was not that what you would normally go to the theater to see. And Brecht basically became the father of what we now call applied theater. We've had several different iterations of it. But it's really interesting that it came out of that same post-war experience, well, during the war and then the post-war experience of World War I. And there are a number of ethical considerations that we need to look at when we're talking about the applied theater practice, particularly in these types of contexts. And the first question that I normally ask is, who is funding it? Because when you think about who's funding it, you're automatically thinking about what is their agenda, right? So you don't want to go into a project naively thinking that you can just explore any and every topic that you want to explore, because your funders are going to have very specific guidelines. And how much do you want to rock that boat? Now, for me, personally, I have to say I am a boat rocker. So I am the one that is going to say, no, I'm not interested in what your funding is giving me, you know, the okay to do. I want to represent the history as authentically as possible. And within the context of something like World War I, you want to be able to show it from different sides. You don't only want to be biased towards one point of view. And certainly the same holds true for the research that I'm doing for my PhD, because you want to be able to share, yes, this is what happened, but what are the other stories that we're missing? What have we not privileged? What are the stories that kind of constantly get swept under the rug and we don't bring to fore? And I think the German internment in Barbados was one of those stories that we really wanted to delve into and recognize how these people were affected in that time. So the question of funding is important. The question of who's your audience is important. One of the things about the work that I do, particularly here with the museum, is that we try to bring the history into a space that is not historical. We don't just want to perform to esteemed guests like yourselves who will come to a historical lecture. We are looking to get this information out to the general public. So the public is more likely to go to, let's say Laugh It Off was on tonight. You know, they're going to go to Laugh It Off. They're probably not going to come to a history lecture. And what we're saying is, let's find a way to use theater to now make this information, which is still quite relevant to our historical context, and make that information available to a wider audience. We obviously also have to look at the question of consent. Now, consent is a funny thing when you're dealing with historical narratives, because most of the people that you're representing, the further back you go, are no longer with us. So how do you get consent from them? This is where we lean into historians like Dr. Scott here on my side. We lean into their expertise because we want to make sure that from a historical perspective, we are representing, I say truth, but truth is also questionable as much as it is authenticity is questionable, but you want to be able to represent as many of those narratives as possible. And I'll end by using a term that was coined by Jill Bennett. One of the things that we want to do in this type of work is to avoid, and I quote, pornographic pain or trauma porn. And what does that mean? We don't just want to sensationalize the spectacle of harm. It is a real thing, it affected real people, and we want to bring attention to the trauma, but we want to make sure that we do it from a sensitive perspective where we are treating it carefully, we are respecting the stories that we are representing, And we are also making sure that the people who we are representing are appropriately portrayed on the stage. And I will end there. I think that's about my 10 minutes. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next panelist will be Lieutenant Commander Fernella Cordell. And she joined the Barbados Defense Force at the age of 19. And she attended the Royal Navy Young Officers course at Britannia Royal Naval College, Dartmouth, in 1997, and earned a Certificate of Higher Education in Naval Studies. I have to let you know that Lieutenant Commander Cordell was the first captain, female captain, of the Coast Guard vessels here in Barbados, and that is an achievement. So besides being a naval officer, she performed duties of aide-de-camp to Lady Husbands, who was the late wife of the former Governor General, to the First Lady of Botswana on an official visit in 2004, and as an equerry to Countess Sophie on the occasion of the Diamond Jubilee visit to Barbados in 2012. When she came off sea duty, she performed the duties of Executive Officer of the Barbados Coast Guard for about 2 years, 2012 to 2014. And then she worked very closely with me, I have to say, when she became the Force Records Officer Adjutant and did an exceptional job. She retired on the 31st of December, 2016. I do believe she didn't stay out for very long because she came back, returned to full-time service in 2020, where she served as the Staff Officer of Strategy, Policy and Plans. She continues to serve Barbados as Infrastructure Program Coordinator, Office of Infrastructure and Planning. Now, Lieutenant Commander Cordell will speak about the contributions to the war effort, which will be the West Indian Volunteers and the Barbadian Soldiers, military roles and operations, the Royal Air Force, anti-submarine, warfare and Caribbean defense, and she would also touch on the legacy and the impact, meaning the post-war influence, national pride, and the military heritage, which is BDS history that is closely tied to the island's colonial past and its role in supporting British military efforts during the World Wars. So without further ado, I give you Lieutenant Commander Cordell.
Thank you, everyone, for that, and Colonel Branch especially for that very warm introduction. And I'll admit that when I saw the panel, I too am not a historian, military student, career military officer, and I was, a little bit hesitant. And it just made me go a little bit deeper. And, sometimes you're overwhelmed, and there's so much to tell, just like Dr. Ward. And if we don't accept and reflect on our past, how can we really plan for a future that is so uncertain right now? So we have a very short and brief history lesson, and in it, and this is something that is always out there. We will talk about the regular West India Regiment, which long predated the Great War, the First World War. We had West Indians who were very nationalistic, who all thought that, we are a part of Britain, we're all citizens. But they were incentivized financially, pay and tax relief. They were also very strongly influenced by religion, because the churches promoted that the war was a battle between good and evil. And then on the macro level, we would have had political aspirations because we wanted independence. Our ancestors faced discrimination, but they persevered, serving with honor, bravery, and much gallantry. But, for that same World War, they were not necessarily welcome because we didn't want to have black soldiers fighting alongside white soldiers and doing certain jobs and performing certain roles. The Caribbean lost men. They're all immortalized in our cenotaphs. These are some of the Barbadian soldiers that would have lost their lives. And again, we celebrated, we honor them every year at the Remembrance Day Parade. We do have, within this current generation, quite a few people who they don't quite understand the significance of World War I and II. They don't quite understand the significance of the loss of life. And we who are in the military, we do see that challenge as well with our current soldiers. So we do have to every year resensitize people to the importance of this ceremony. And we know that whatever happens, we will remember them. The poem in Flanders Field, so poignant. And if you really and carefully examine the words, it will make you emotional. So I'll just go through the slides as I speak. We will fast forward to the Second World War, which was the war meant to end all wars. And for this Second World War, we had over 15,000 people within the colonies enlisting. But once again, the UK was reluctant to recruit West Indians, but they protested. And as we are resilient and we served. Barbados was able to raise 12 soldiers, 12 RAF persons who served valiantly. The most notable of them is Sir Errol Walton Barrow. But we also had people who served as artisans and served in various civil capacities in the UK. The call to volunteer was very good, 2,000, of which only 831 were eventually accepted. And that's a good number. We would like to have some of that now for all the law enforcement entities, and that's a shameless plug for recruitment to serve our country. We move on to within the Caribbean. We all know Barbados is of significant geopolitical importance. Her position, the always having been a British colony, but we were still very important to the Allied forces in providing anti-submarine warfare capability. We know of Harrison Point, but that was a facility, which was a naval facility operated by the US for some 32 years, finally being handed over in 1979 to the Barbados Regiment, and thereafter it was used for a brief time as a training installation of the Barbados Regiment, Barbados Defense Force. And we know recently it was used during the COVID-19 pandemic. Very strategically placed location, which continues to be desirable. Let's leave it right there. As Dr. Ward spoke about, the Caribbean waters were a hotbed. Barbados was a target for German submarine attacks. We had the Cornwallis, where she was she was torpedoed in Carlisle Bay, along with a Norwegian flagship Betancuria, which we don't hear a lot about. But the Cornwallis being torpedoed, here she suffered a damage 13 meters by 4 meters long. They fixed her and they then towed her, and she was torpedoed. She eventually sank, having been torpedoed again. They towed her to Mobile, Alabama, where she underwent a major repair. Drawing another linkage to modern BDF, our first flagship, Her Majesty's Barbados ship Trident, she underwent her very, very first life extension refit at the same Mobile, in the same Mobile, Alabama. So that legacy of what we did and how we prepared ourselves for our future continues throughout. That the raid on the Cornwallis and Carlisle Bay happened even though there was an anti-torpedo net across the bay. And, you know, she was sunk by a U-boat 514, which was subsequently sunk as well in the Bay of Biscay. We didn't learn a lot about other U-boat activity around Barbados, but we also had another U-boat which was sunk off the East Coast by a U.S. patrol aircraft. So an agreement too with everything. I mean, Dr. Ward needs to come and give us a talk in the BDF about the maritime importance and what went on in our waters, and that is something that I will be advocating for. But coming out of all of that occurred, we had an act passed, the 1917 Vegetable Produce Act, which encouraged landowners to cultivate vegetables to ensure food security. Do we hear that lesson again coming back to us in 2025? Out of that process of having all the U-boat activity, the shipping that was carrying supplies between South America, the islands, and up to Europe, we had 58 Germans and Austrian seamen who were interred in Glenderry. And I'll leave this more for Professor Max to speak about. But we also saw Glenderry as a prison, and out of the experiences of the barbed wire disease was born the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 1948, because persons were interred in both world wars. They've learnt from World War I, and conditions possibly slightly improved by World War II. But an enemy is an enemy, and we know how we will treat our enemies. We will be very skeptical that, yes, you are here quietly, and if you still have links to the enemy nation, we will always be treating you with a level of, second guessing. Is this really true? But the principles which are adhered to and evident in our unions or workplace practices are ingrained in us still as Barbadians and humans, because human rights is a very, very important part of military service and in how we treat our soldiers and our prisoners of war. So, post-war experiences of Barbadian soldiers during World War II shaped their perspectives on equality and justice. And that too contributed to our island's push for independence. We know all about Sir Errol Walton Barrow, and I will draw a link with him and our incumbent president, the Most Honorable Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Bostic, who led us through the COVID-19 pandemic as Minister of Health. The tenets and the principles ingrained in him allowed him to coin, and that's a phrase we still follow, never retreat, never surrender. So we're paving the way. We've learned from the past in order to come forward to the present. Further, we have I'm going to have to fall through these slides a little bit quickly now, seeing that Colonel Branch has given me my 10-minute warning. So the Barbados Defense Force is very strongly still tied to colonial practices. All militaries who were members of the Commonwealth. The practices, the principles, our teachings have served us well. We're fully disciplined, and we do these are some images again. We always continue to adhere and to embody all our symbols of pride, industry, and nationhood. We have, this is a video, you won't be able to see it. It will take up my time. But in terms of commemorating ourselves, last year, we were able, with the museum as a partner, to stage an exhibition. The exhibit not only aimed to recognize the growth of the force post-World War, but also served as a reminder and to educate visitors and locals of where we came from, the experiences we endured, and where we still have to go. Our work, our dress, our symbols, and our emblems, our routines continue also to honor and recognize our heritage and our heroes. I'm going to shamelessly plug the Barbados Poppy League because our soldiers, our veterans, still need to be taken care of. And that is one critical way that we can, as just normal citizens, $1, $2 here, can help them to continue to be honored. So, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
Well, thank you, Lieutenant Commander Cardle. I hope that if we have time at the end, after the question and answer, you might be able to show us that video. Our next panelist is Dr. Cleve Scott, who graciously agreed to stand in for Dr. Henderson Carter, and he is with the History Department at the University of the West Indies. So, Dr. Scott, since it was such a short replacement, I would appreciate it, before you start, to just give us a quick bio about yourself, because we didn't have time to get it, for me to be able to speak about you tonight. But I do know that Dr. Scott will be speaking about Barbados and the Caribbean in a general overview in World War I. So, Dr. Scott.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Colonel. And I would say to you, they say your past always follows you. We were in a van heading to Boston when Michael Pena called Dr. Carter to remind him of this exercise. And Dr. Carter, having been to my house many times and seeing on the wall a picture of me in military uniform from 3 decades ago, taken right here in this museum, where I got married to my wife. And we had military personnel from across the region. And so, Lieutenant Colonel Branch, just to remind you, I was in St. Anne's Fort almost 40 years ago in the mess when we had a guy who was walking around without any stripes, and I wanted to know why such an old fella didn't have a stripe. And I heard what he did in Grenada. And only me and you would remember that guy, right? And you, of course, Lieutenant Commander. So, yes, I have a military background, and I'm here replacing Dr. Carter. He wanted me to tell you about some love stories that took place between the Germans who were confined to Glenderry prison and some local women who were writing love letters and throwing them across over the wall. But I wanted it not to be funny. I want to be serious. And so I will say to you this, that the First World War is perhaps the most important event globally in the history of the world. The First World War, not the Second World War. Why? In the Caribbean, it is the First World War that leads to what we call self-government. In the late 19th century, the British introduced what is called Crown Colony government, and only 3 countries escaped it. The 3 Bs, Bahamas, Bermuda, and Barbados. All across the region, the elected representative assemblies were removed. They were removed for the fear that the liberated blacks would become powerful enough and take over these assemblies and perhaps do reverse racism. And part of this action, which the Lieutenant Commander pointed to, was the fact that the British removed the military from all across the different territories except Barbados. They did this in around 1854. The only place the military was kept intact was in Barbados, of course, at St. Anne's Fort. And that meant that when the First World War broke out, the British had a big problem. They had a big problem. The only place they could rely on in this part of the world was Barbados. And of course, way up, so Jamaica. And Barbados became a central point for recruitment and transshipment. And hence the reason why the Germans, I don't mean you know, the Germans targeted Barbados because here is where the ships were coming to collect the troops to take them to Europe. And in Europe, it is well documented that these black West Indians had a hell of a time. I spent many, many hours in the archives in England reading the War Office's documents. You had colonial governors writing to London saying, okay, make sure when this guy comes back to this country, he doesn't bring a white wife because he doesn't have enough resources to take care of a white wife and so on. And the instances where men brought back white wives and the governors make sure they took the next boat back out and so on. Then you had reports of persons who were on the front line, told to report to another location, and next thing they're on a boat back home. They have no particulars, as a term. You familiar with that term? Particulars? Mm-hmm. Right? In other words, what the staff officer might call your file, right? Your file. When did you enlist? What was your role? What kind of pension you should have? So a lot of men came back to the region without any particulars and didn't get pension for a long, long time. We do know that the majority of men who went came from Jamaica, about 10,000, from Barbados, about 800, and then after that we had, I think it's Trinidad, about 2,000. But Barbados had the most for all of the smaller islands like St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Dominica, Grenada, Antigua, and so on. And when they returned without any money, having put their life on the line for the empire, a lot of them were very, I was going to use a word, but it might not be diplomatic. They were mad. They were mad. They were real mad. They were angry. How could I, as a British citizen, a British member of the British Empire, I have gone, been on the front line, and now I'm back, I don't have anything. And many of them petitioned London asking for land, insisting that they must get their pensions. And we have all of the records in the archives. Nobody from the archives there. We, here in Barbados, we have a lot of the records of the pensions and so on for the demobilized soldiers. Now, we know in Trinidad that Captain Arthur Cipriani was one of the first of these demobilized soldiers to begin to kick hell, as we would say, to cause an uproar, creating what was called the Working Men's Association. And the Working Men's Association spread throughout the region. You have Working Men's Association in Grenada, in St. Vincent, in Antigua, and in Barbados you have your own version, which I can't remember now. It's called the Democratic something something, which was the forerunner to the Labour Party and the Democratic Party, okay? So, now, while all of that is going on, what do you do with these men that have no work to do? And they want money. In Barbados, they develop a scheme to send them to Cuba to work. The governor, at the time, he wants to make sure he doesn't have a problem, and so he sends out a memo to the various islands and say, the work in Cuba that we are collecting men in Barbados is for Bajans only. So make sure you keep those fellas in Grenada, make sure you keep them in Dominica, don't let them come here, all right? Okay? So that the First World War, for not only the Caribbean, globally, in Africa, it leads to the early decolonization movement, with the formation of the League of Nations, the creation of what we call the mandate system and the protectorates. If you follow what's happening in in Gaza, Lebanon, in Israel, that's the origin, the mandate system, where in the settlement of the First World War, the British, through a man called Balfour, issued what was called the Balfour Declaration and say, okay, we are going to create a new state called Israel, and this is what is going to happen. So what we are experiencing now is the legacies of the First World War. Okay, that's in the Middle East. So I tell you, Africa, the Middle East, in the Caribbean. Now, Jeff dealt with the shipping, and you could understand why after the First World War that we have more focus on monitoring the marine system in the region. And hence, for example, by the time we go to the Second World War, here in Barbados we have Lieutenant Commander Harrison Point. And in Trinidad we have Chagaramas. And you all know about the Treaty of Chagaramas and so on. Another thing that Jeff mentioned was the coaling station in St. Lucia and so on. And all of that has its origin out of the First World War. And so after the First World War, we have in the region, in terms of the military, a greater commitment from Britain and the local institutions to reinstate military operations. And so you have across the region the various cadet force or cadet corps and so on. So St. Vincent, 1936, where I'm from, formed by a man who came from Barbados, Major Dowden Crozier, and all across the region. And then you have the reemergence of the different defense forces and the consolidation. So you have Antigua, Montserrat, Turks and Caicos, Cayman Islands, and I'll tell you this, Lieutenant Colonel Branch, you probably don't know this. A lot of these are being run by people who are trained by the BDF. Thank you very much, Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Scott. Well, for the whole evening, I've been learning a whole lot, that's for sure. We know our next panelist, who is no stranger. I'm sure that those of you who went into the exhibition would have seen him on the screen already. So now we're seeing him in person here. Professor Stefan Mans. He is a professor of global history at Aston University, Birmingham, UK. He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a research associate at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. His last book, Enemies in the Empire, from the Oxford University Press in 2020, was the first to tackle civilian internment in the First World War across the British Empire, including the Caribbean. His forthcoming book, Making Food Empires, which is due out in 2026, covers the spread of German food science in the 19th century and contains a chapter on rum, my favorite thing here again, rum production in Barbados. As a public historian, Stefan has communicated his research in many countries through exhibitions. This evening, he's going to speak to us about the development and the conceptualization of the exhibition, which we just saw. He's going to speak a little bit about the decolonization, how it was digitized, and the World War I as public history. So I will just keep quiet now and hand over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for giving me the opportunity to talk here. As we've heard in the previous papers, we've heard how important the First World War was and how important it is to actually remember the First World War for strategic reasons, for cultural reasons, etc. And this is where I want to say a few words about ways in which historians can actually, through collaboration with partners uphold the remembrance of the First World War, which is particularly poignant this day around Remembrance Sunday, Remembrance Day, collaborate with artists like Michelle, with heritage professionals such as the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, and take you through some of the development of the exhibition, which you either have already seen or will be able to see after this talk. So the original, or the first step is obviously doing the research. So the broad framework is really that I discovered by going into archives, just like my historian colleague. We're spending lots of hours in the archives discovering that around 50,000 civilians of German, Austrian, and Turkish nationality, civilians, not military prisoners of war, but civilians, were interned in Britain and the Empire. Those were alleged spies, saboteurs, and especially reservists who posed a danger to the safety of the British Empire, because as soon as they would travel back to Germany, they might join the German ranks and then fight against the British. So there were reasons for detaining them. And as I said, 50,000 of those were then detained in camps around the world. I should do this. Around the world. And as you can see on this map, our research then enabled us to draw a map of internment camps, and you really see this as a global spread. Does this work? Yeah, from Canada via India down to New Zealand. And you see the Caribbean right in the middle. So those who were detained in Barbados and other Caribbean camps, those were mainly seamen taken from ships and then taken into custody for the next 4 or 5 years. Our research also enabled us to create this map of travel and deportation routes. And again, you see how central the Caribbean is within these global transportation routes that we identify. So this is a global story, but how do you actually communicate that story? And this is where collaborations come in. You need to connect to people and you need to connect to places. So once I had done the research, I got in touch with colleagues from around the world who I had collaborated with, who had their own heritage contacts. And in Barbados, I was very happy that the museum actually was interested in that topic, which enabled me to create the exhibition. How this all took place, just to give you an idea that this is not the only iteration of the exhibition. It has been shown in other places around the world where there were internment camps, where that part of the First World War took place. And again, we need to tap into collective and individual memories if you want to communicate that story. And the internment story does involve individuals who were actually affected. They were not soldiers, they were civilians. So a lot of museum visitors or theater visitors, they can actually identify with that story. Had I been traveling in the British Empire 100 years ago, had a German passport, I would have been the one ending up in one of those camps. Here are just 2 examples. One is from, I'm operating different system. Yeah, here we go. So on the left-hand side, this is the biggest camp in mainland Britain, in the kind of southern part of Scotland, near Hawick. Top left, that's what it looked like, the internment camps. So much larger than operations in Barbados, obviously. And this is an exhibition which I curated together with Hawick Museum. And you see in the glass case little objects that were actually produced by the prisoners in the camp. These are wood carvings, bone carvings, picture frames. These prisoners had 4 or 5 years in detention. They had to do something, And this again, these objects really connect that story, that 100-year-old story, with present-day experiences as well. On the right-hand side, this is just one other example. When it was shown in Canada, there were huge internment operations in Canada. A lot of the national parks, if you've been to Canada, I haven't, or just for that exhibition, but the infrastructure in many of the national parks were actually built by those First World War internees. So as we've just heard, the impact is still seen today. So if you travel those roads, a lot of these will have been built by Ukrainian nationals. And again, this is a story that harks back to today's situation. Ukrainians at the time had an Austro-Hungarian passport. There was Ukrainian immigration into Canada, and on account of that passport, they were then stuck into these labor camps and built much of the infrastructure in the Canadian West. And the box here on the right, that was a kind of little box. You see the pattern there that looks a bit Russian, Ukrainian. That was actually produced by one of the Ukrainian internees. I collaborated with a Canadian colleague on that exhibition who had a piece of barbed wire, which you see in that glass case as well, and that Ukrainian box. So again, connecting objects to people with those 100 years old story is quite an efficient way of presenting that story. Now for Barbados, I thoroughly revised the previous iterations of the exhibition, which used to be the kind of global stories. In Canada, for example, I had 2 or 3 panels on the Canadian situation, but apart from that, that was the global story. So as you can see, on the left hand, I've got different buttons here to press, so there we go. On the first panel, the introduction panel, which is in the exhibition hall, you see the right-hand one. That's Caribbean and global stories of internment. The global one, that was the left one, but that was the previous iteration. And if you read the text below, the first one was dedicated to the memory of more than 1 million civilians of all nationalities. And on the right-hand side, I inserted different colors in order to make that more appropriate for the Caribbean context. Also in terms of content, as you walk into the exhibition hall, on the left-hand side, you pretty much see a white story of white British interning white Germans, more or less. On the right-hand side, those are panels that I curated and collaborated with various historians who actually did some research into the internment of Caribbean civilians, mostly seamen, who had a British passport. They were stuck into German internment camps. So we've got the reciprocal part of the story as well, which is teased out there. And on the you have to remind me when I have to press the right button. There we go. So left-hand side, that's an overview of the original exhibition. I condensed quite a few of those panels, or got rid of some panels, and then full panels on the West Indies in the First World War, enemy aliens in Barbados, treatment Trinidad, Jamaica, Bermuda, and then Caribbean internees in Germany. And a very cool story, which a colleague of mine from the United States dug out, a jazz musician from Barbados, Avondale Roberts, who had actually gone to music college in Germany around 1910 and then was a star on the German jazz scene. He was obviously then interned as well, kept on playing jazz in the internment camp, and then had married a German. He had a German wife, reconnected with her after the First World War, and then carried on playing in the Roaring Twenties jazz. So he's a famous Barbadian in Germany, which, has anyone, is he known? No, not known. Anyone knows about him? There we go. There's a huge story to be uncovered there as well, in creating those connections. Now, when we create that story, we have to think of the younger generation as well. We have to deliver formats that are not like the 300 pages book, which I showed at the beginning, which Is that me up? My time? Yeah, 2 minutes. Okay. So we need to create new formats to reach younger audiences. It was interesting when we did the showing there. I think there are a couple of children in the audience. Is it children? So the children went straight to the VR headset and watched the film. There we go. That's exactly the purpose which we're trying to reach. We've produced a virtual reality experience, which is not just for children. I encourage you to watch it as well. It's a serious production, and in line with what Michelle just said, it's a serious engagement with the historical sources, but retold through creative means, not on a physical stage, but through a VR headset. There are VR headsets, so you can all watch the experience afterwards. We did launch this in KwaZulu-Natal Museum. There are different stories to be told about race and all the things you just mentioned. And this was collaboration with a digital creative company, and the CEO and creative director is Paul in the back there. If you want to chat to him, he produced together with myself and a bunch of historians the virtual reality experiences. We keep doing these showings, storyboarding, VR workshops, and we will do that in the course of the next week with students in Barbados as well. So this links up with a few broader questions, I think, which other panelists have already touched on as well. So how should we remember the First World War? Global rather than national. We don't want to reiterate any national demarcations. You hear from my accent that I'm German myself, so it's very close to my heart, not just to have these kind of national remembrance patterns. This is an installation which museum colleagues in KwaZulu-Natal Museum did, not just showing the red poppy, but the red poppy with flowers from other countries that represent loss through war. The French cornflower, the German forget-me-not, and we've got some black poppies in there as well. So they took my exhibition as a starting point for reflecting wider issues about remembrance. And this is for young children who are encouraged to take one of these flowers and put it in front of their favorite object in the exhibition. So it's again linking up to the next generation. And the last point here on that slide, it's digital. I think we have to go digital. We can't just write our books. We have to find new formats to reach new audiences in order to communicate that story to the next generations. I'll stop here, hopefully on time. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you, Professor Mans, for taking us through how you built the exhibition. And I very much like how you ended by giving encouragement for us to use the digital platform, especially to reach our children. Our final panelist is a colleague of mine on the Protective Services Commission, and I consider him to be a walking encyclopedia. He always takes the time to enlighten you whenever we have our meetings or whenever we are just talking about any point. He will say, you know about that, you know about that, and then you have a history lesson that will follow. And you can tell because Pat Callender was a primary school teacher for 3 years when he first started working. And then he went on to be a certified air traffic control officer, first at the Civil Airport and then into the Grantley Adams International Airport. Pat is also a certified aircraft pilot, having been trained in the Barbados Light Aircraft Club. And we best know him as being the manager of the Grantley Adams International Airport, and I think it was for about 23 years or so, Pat? 23 years. Yes. In 1969, the Barbados Oceanic and Meteorological Experiment was conducted in Barbados, during which he was responsible for ensuring the safety of air operations for many sophisticated aircraft which participated in the program. The Sahara dust, as we know it today, was discovered during this exercise, and he was actually on board the primary aircraft charting the passage of aerosol particles transiting the Atlantic and drifting across the Caribbean and into North America. Pat did his studies in Canada, and he was also instrumental in the apprehension of the 2 criminals who were directly responsible for placing explosives on board the Cubana Airlines Flight 455. You know, we have the monument for them every year to remember. So Pat has a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of experience. He's the only surviving member of the team which negotiated the return of the United States Naval Base to the government of Barbados, which you would have remembered Lieutenant Commander Cardle mentioned. Mr. Callender is the author of the book, Flight Paths and Missing Connections, which recounts many experiences of his early life and working career. This evening, he's going to bring it straight home, and he's going to talk to us about the life and times of Henry Oscar Atkins, a Barbadian World War veteran. Mr. Callender.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel. As a night watchman, it's always very difficult, you know, when you have so many people, experienced people ahead of you. But I'll try my best. And I don't have a watch, so I hope you can keep me on track. First thing I would like to say, I'll try to keep my comments to World War I, and particularly to a gentleman from Carner's Village. But first, let me say this about World War I. It was a very dirty encounter. It was steeped in racism because the soldiers who left Barbados thought that they were going to fight for the mother country. But when they got there, they were given all types of dangerous and dirty jobs. As you knew, in those days, they didn't have much motorized transport. So those fellows had to lift those heavy shells and do all the dirty work. And sometimes it would be helped by the horses. They had many of those around. But then they had to traverse land which was swept by the, I think it's the MG8, that's the Germans used. Is that correct? That's the, anyhow, they had their machine guns. The British had the Lewis guns, and the whole landscape was being swept by these machine guns. So if you happen to be caught in there, you know what would happen to you. They just fell like flies. But the gentleman I'm going to concentrate on, his name was, well, if you look back at the few documents that exist, you'll see among the first contingent a question mark, and then Oscar Atkins, the very first name there, that left here on the Verdala. It was a cargo ship that was converted, and it became the HMT Verdala, HMT being Her Majesty's troop ship. And it did make many trips to Barbados and around the Caribbean, taking soldiers. So Henry, his name was Henry Oscar Atkins. His name was the first that appeared there. It doesn't appear anywhere here in this museum. I speak in the correction. Oh, does it? I didn't see it. However, his name was the very first there. And then he was, the commanders was, if I remember correctly, was one Captain Thorne. The other one was, trying to remember the name now. That was Keith Walker. He was second lieutenant. But the other one was George Challenger, who was a cricketer. George Challenger. So there were the officers. And these men went on to unknown fate. They thought, really thought, they were helping the mother country. But there was a rule in the British army or military that if you were black, stand back. you could not fight against the German whites. That was something that was not done. There was a gentleman called Kitchener. I don't mean the one who sings songs with long hair. He was Lord Kitchener, Lord Horatio, Herbert Kitchener. Horatio, as you know, you had Horatio Nelson, and Kitchener was born on the day of the Battle of Trafalgar, 1805, so that's why he got the name Horatio. But he was an abject racist, and he had served in South Africa, and he had starved a lot of the South Africans, the whites and the blacks. Very vicious character, that even at some stage, when Winston Churchill, who was out there also fighting, objected, he just paid no attention. People were starved, they were brutalized, and whatever. Then after that, I think he went over to Egypt. In fact, he served several places. He served in India, and he also served in the Middle East, as did many of our soldiers. It's not known, but they were instrumental in the liberation of Jerusalem, for example. They also served in Egypt. But Henry, Oscar, are there any military men here? You're military. Could you tell me, what is the pet name for a British soldier? Tommy. Okay, why I ask that? Mr. Henry Oscar Atkins was known for the entire period he was in service as Tommy Atkins because of his exploits. Whereas the other people would have to do all the dirty menial work, he was a kind of fearless person who would volunteer for duty, sentry duty, and also to do like patrols, getting information so you can kill more Germans the following day. But let me digress here. In the war started on the 26th of July, I think, 1914. And a strange thing happened. Around Christmas time, the Germans started to make overtures because you can actually see virtually the eyes of your enemy. It's not like today when you don't see them. And they started to make overtures to the British. And they were shouting out, "Tommy, Tommy!" And eventually, the British started to reply with machine guns. And then they realized that the Germans were not replying. And a strange thing happened. It only happened that once. There was a truce. And the Germans came over and they shared food, they shared pictures, and even played a game of football with the troops that they were trying to kill. It only happened once. Anyhow, in between that, the Germans had their pill boxes there with these guns mounted, and there were two people who handled those guns. And I got this all from Henry Oscar. I'll tell you about that later on. And they would, the soldiers from the Caribbean would be asked to take the ammunition, food, and water over to the forward trenches across open land with the Germans operating the machine guns, and they fell like flies. But Tommy realized that he didn't want to be in those trenches. There were lots of rats, lots of rice, lots of mud, and sometimes he told me that he actually had to drink the water out of the trenches. So by volunteering forward, he escaped a lot of that. But one night, after volunteering for several weeks, because he served for many years there, he fell asleep to be woken by a squad of several of his colleagues, and the commanding officer pointing his pistol straight at his head. Those of you from the military might know that the British were very cruel to their own soldiers. And they actually did more executions in the field than almost any other nation, I'm told. But the men begged for him because he was such a good soldier, and his life was spared, only to go through a lot of suffering. Henry told me, let's call him Tommy because that's what they used to call him, that he managed to break away from his squad because in fighting there's all the smoke around, there's the smell of cordite, the bullets flying all around, and sometimes he said having to lie among corpses that were actually burst open there and smelling bad, but if you want to save your life, that was the only way. So after some time, he got away from his squad. When I say got away, I don't mean he wanted to get away, but he strayed away in the heat of battle. And for 4 or 5 days, just before around Christmas 1917, he said hunger was something that he experienced for the first time, and they still had to keep going because if they wanted to save their lives, they had to keep going. So he and a small group came across a farm that the Germans had not yet destroyed, because the Germans were very good at doing that. And of all the things, the lady of the house, the young lady, had just finished baking. The cows had just been milked. They had some homemade cheese, and they had the pastry, and of all things, copious amounts of wine. So they had a feast, and they were very sad when they had to leave there 2 days later. They took what they can, and they managed to get back to their group. Henry eventually came back to Barbados. He left here in 1915. It's almost time. You must forgive me, I got carried away. Henry eventually came back to Barbados and immediately found things were hard. You would think that a soldier coming back here would come back with some money and that he would find some type of occupation here. But the powers that be thought that the returning soldiers were dangerous and they might start to cause some type of revolution. Yeah, we did have people here that could have done that. You might have heard about Daniel Wickham, for example. He became some type of politician. He was a soldier, yes. In Jamaica, we had Norman Manley, World War veteran too. And then I heard someone mention about Cipriani, Arthur Cipriani, Captain Arthur Cipriani. They are descendants, the Ciprianis are descendants of Napoleon Bonaparte. They live in Trinidad. So you had the nucleus of people who had become very disillusioned about how the British were treating them and could cause a lot of trouble here in Barbados. So what did the British do? Well, before they did that, there was a place called Toronto. I'm going to get ahead of myself at the time. There was a place called Toronto in Italy. If you know Italy, it's like a boot. And the heel, between the heel and the sole, there's this place called Toronto. This is where Mussolini and those people eventually kept all of their ships and so on. That's going to World War II, however. But what happened there is the soldiers were being demobilized, they were treated very badly, and they revolted. The result of that, some were in prison, one was executed, put before the firing squad, and so on. They were sent back home, and on top of that, the British sent out their warships equipped with machine guns. And one was parked right here in Carlisle Bay. We had some in Trinidad and Jamaica, just to make sure these fellas didn't give trouble. But of course, you know, trouble started anyhow later on in 1937. Am I getting ahead of myself here? Okay. Now let's go back. Is there anything I want to mention on this particular? Okay, let's go to the slides quickly. Now about Panama, what happened there, the British government thought that if they can encourage these people to go to Panama, as you know, Panama was being developed, the Panama Canal was being developed, and they wanted labor. Of course, when you go out there, you have the problem with malaria and other types of disease carried by mosquitoes. I might say this in passing, contrary to what you might have heard from the Americans, that the man who really brought an end to the scourge of the mosquito was a Cuban called Carlos Finlay. Are there any Cubans here? Are there Cubans here? I think there are. I think there are two there. Yeah, his name was Carlos Finlay, but of course Walter Reed and Georges Gorgas, I think his name was, they got the credit for it. And that is usually happened that, you know, as long as you're from a small country, these type of things happen. So I believe he went off to Panama, and then something else happened in the 1920s. In fact, it started in 1870, yes. There was a company started up in Venezuela. Venezuela, you know the other name for Venezuela? It's the Venice of the West. That's Venezuela. That's what the name was. Amerigo Pusey, he gave it that name. However, the company was called the Seconee Company. Oh, Seconee. Do anybody knows what Seconee is? It stood for the Southern Oil Company of New York. Seconee, Southern Oil Company of New York. And to those of you who might wonder what that meant, S-O is S-E-S-S-O. So you know what it means now. There was a company, S-O, that was formed out of Seconee. So they opened there and they found they had gushes, they had all types of fuel. They found oil in the ground there around Lake Maracaibo. And Henry worked there for many years, many, many years. In fact, a lot of the land was taken away from the Indians. I can't say these things because I don't want to get locked up. But the land was taken from the Indians. And the Seconee Company was owned by a group in New York called the Rockefellers. You probably heard about that name. And I'm told that at some stage, I'm not using it. I'm told at some stage that that company's budget revenue was greater than the budget of the entire United States government. And they tried the same thing in the Middle East, whereas, you know, we had some of our boys fighting there against the Ottomans, but it didn't work out, and the Saudi Arabians and all these other people decide to do their own development of oil. That'll take up more of the time. As the years rolled by, because Tommy had left here somewhere around 1925, and the oil would start to swing in Venezuela around 1920, 22. So he got very interested. His family here heard nothing from him because he got married to a nice young lady. Her name was Martha Jane. Okay, let's say that for the time. And she hadn't seen him after he left Barbados. She had two children for him. One was Perlita Juanita, and the other one was, could you help me, Michael? Perlita Juanita. Michael, could you stand a minute? What's that? Thank you, yes. And the other one was that. That's Henry there. He was a very handsome man, but you know, age is what it does to you. And this gentleman I asked to stand here, he was the adopted son of Juanita. Am I correct? Yes. So you have it from the horse's mouth. And when I say things, I don't like to have it from 3 and 4 different people. I try to get my facts straight. However, he started to have an interest in his family then, having left around 1925. And the family started to hear that there were cries being asked about the family. And then suddenly communication started. That's many, many years later. And in 1956, Henry turned up on the LAV aircraft, the DC-3, to Barbados. And it was so much joy. Because not only did he turn up, but he seemed to have an endless supply of money. Those people paid him very well. He was a cook par excellence. In fact, I happened to eat some of his food. I did mention that there was the Spanish rice, the anchovies, sandwiches, all types of pastry. There's nothing that man couldn't do because he'd got his experience in in Europe. He was in I believe in Panama, and there now he was there enjoying life in Venezuela. So he came back in, and he settled down. I was a young man, well, teenager at the time, and I kept badgering him all the time about his war service. And he was very reluctant because they did a lot of bad things, had to do a lot of bad things during the war. And sometimes he would say to me, my Bayesian English would say, I remember this very clearly, si no habla clara, yo no entiende. I think that's what he said. Then he wanted to get rid of me, but I got enough of him to know what happened during that World War, during the time he was in World War, and they would take me the whole evening to go through all this thing for you. So at this point, I will stop. There's a lot more I have to say, but I don't want to say it now because it would take the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Callender. I do know from personal experience, there's a lot more to tell. I think we've had a very educational evening. We have 6 experts here sitting at the table. As I said before, I have learned a lot this evening about what happened with our Caribbean people during World War I, how the exhibition was made, and as Commander Cardle said, the effect it has had in terms of the Barbados Defense Force that we know today. So at this point, I would like to open the floor for questions to our 6 panelists.
If anyone has a question, the microphone is right here. I can come to you. Okay.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask Professor Mance, there was a map of the world that you had up at one point, and I think it said, it had some arrows on it. I think, was it deportations was the word? It seemed almost like towards the end of the war, there was like a rationalization of where the interned prisoners were held. Was there a particular rationale for that? I mean, I'm assuming it's because it was for economic reasons or whatever. But also, a more general point, I mean, throughout the evening, we've been referring to World War I as the terminology. But with the exception of, I think, Japan and Turkey, it was really a European war, Europe and its colonies, which took it into the world. So, I mean, do you have any comment as to really we should be calling it European War I or even European Tribal War I, as some people have sort of phrased it?
About your first question, absolutely. There was some trial and error at the beginning of the war. So the British had interned, obviously, 15 years before the First World War in South Africa, the Boers. So that was a localized incidence of civilian internment. So as soon as a world war, it wasn't quite a world war yet, but as something more complex broke out, that policy was continued, but it had to be globalized in some way or the other. And the first phase of the war was actually a phase of trial and error. So we detained people locally, but as soon as those numbers got bigger and bigger, these small prisons or makeshift camps just weren't enough, so more had to be built. And you're absolutely right, as the war progressed, bigger and bigger camps were built. The biggest one on the Isle of Man, in the Irish Sea, started off as one compound, and then as more and more people were interned, up to 20,000 at one point in that one camp, so 20,000, that's a huge operation. More and more compounds were added, and more people were then deported. So from British colonies in West Africa, for example, there were sizable merchant communities, German merchant and industrialists, but also artisans and all kinds of professions. They were first detained locally, but then you were referring to the second map, the deportation routes. So they were then taken at one point to these larger camps. A big one was in South Africa, but the biggest one on the Isle of Man. So yes, absolutely, during the course of the war, a sort of concentration. Actually, the word concentration camp was used for those camps as well, which is an interesting irony in history. Your second point, yes, it was sort of a European war, but it developed globally. But what has been done over the last few years, moving away from a sole concentration on the Western Front. So for decades, it was just all about the Western Front. And those forgotten people of the Barbadians and Caribbeans, which we've heard about, those were not part of the history books. So as people think more about global histories and how things are actually coming together and are connected, those stories can actually be integrated into those global stories. I don't know whether I've answered your question, but it's sort of an attempt. It's a complex one.
If I may, to your second point, the First World War wasn't known as the First World War. It was known as the Great War. Mm-hmm. It's only when the Second World War started, they couldn't call that the Greater War. And it's only in the Second World War that they actually started calling it World War I and World War II. But until the Second World War, it was known as the Great War. It didn't have any type of World War I connotation to it.
Yeah, I was going to explain how historians, we name things. Jeff explained that part, but I want to say to you, there's no guarantee that in the future, Caribbean historians will call it that. For example, Bimsha. I don't think there's a generation who know what is Bimsha. And Barbados, right? If you go to Alsop Dictionary of Caribbean English Usage, names change, terminologies change. And as Jeff said, with the Great War and the First World War, that in post-colonial societies, the First World War or World War I gives a particular connotation. There are some wars that took place in the late 18th and 19th century. They are known by different names in the Caribbean or in the West Indies compared to in England. For example, you have Queen Anne's War and King George War, which are in the Caribbean called different things. Okay? So terminologies can change. For me, as a historian, is what's in a name? When Barbados was becoming a republic, everybody was asking, what will be the name of Barbados? Would it be the Commonwealth or the Republic? For me, what is more important, it is the significance. And as I said earlier, when we think about the history of this region, the First World War is perhaps the most important event after 1834. And for Barbados, after 1914, the most important date is perhaps 1937. Mm-hmm. And again, after the most important date perhaps might be 51 or 1966. Okay? So I would say to you that as modern historians, we emphasize not the thing itself, but what the thing represents. The older colonial historians would want you to be preoccupied with the thing and not what it represents.
Thank you, Dr. Scott.
Hi, good evening. This question is for Professor Mans. You have mentioned about the barbed wire, about the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians who were actually incarcerated and detained. But was there ever any study that was done about the ones who did return to the fatherland? Was that ever explored because I know that a lot of them probably would have gone home, back to Germany to take part in the war effort. That's one. And then the second question would be, is there a parallel study that was done in respect of the Japanese who would have experienced something similar, having been against the Allies during the World War II, not necessarily World War I, but World War II?
So the first question was about returning to Germany, what happened. They had not fought on the front line, and that was a problem for them because they did not return as heroes. I mean, no German soldiers really returned as heroes. That's a national trauma, or was a national trauma at the time. But for those reservists who were stuck abroad, the thinking at the time was their kind of honor should have dictated to them that they would have made it home and then fought against the enemy. They weren't able to do that. And many of them were breadwinners of families. So they were not able to support their families. And historians have talked about the kind of double emaciation of those internees. They couldn't support the families and they couldn't fight for the fatherland, so to speak. And when they came home, they were forgotten because they hadn't fought on the front line. So they were the forgotten victims of the First World War. And then obviously the Second World War came along and much bigger questions had. So in a way, those people were never really part of any official remembrance culture. And that's exactly what we now do 100 years later, to give those forgotten voices a voice and write about them and put them on exhibition panels. Your second question about Japan, there's a lot of literature on Japanese internment in the Second World War, and there was an apology from President Reagan in the 1980s for those. So those Japanese were part of that remembrance culture. Next to the Capitol in Washington, there's a memorial for them. But here we go into the territory of power structures. So who is remembered and who isn't? The Japanese ones were remembered because Japan was on the rise in the United, or was a powerful industrial nation, and the Americans, for strategic reasons, had every reason to apologize, put a monument there. So remembrance is all about power, it's about money and industry and all kinds of other things, but this is again where we come in and try to rebalance those power shifts a little bit and write about people who might not have been part of those official remembrance cultures. Sorry, that was a very long answer. That's what historians do.
Yes, we have got a question. Can we have a question, not to bias any of your questions, but just one maybe for some of the other panelists. Give Professor Mance just a quick break.
Good night. I won't start with a question. I just wanted to first of all share that I have two uncles, my father's brothers, who served in World War I. My father was born in 1891, and I am born in 1956. Now, my father didn't go to World War I. His two brothers went, and they're on that list that Mr. Callender mentioned, the ship Verdala. And I think it's important to share when you all are reaching out to the community and to Barbadians, the fact that there was a distinction between the two regiments. So white Barbadians were in one regiment and black Barbadians were in the other. My uncles were with Mr. Atkins in the black regiment. And they're on that list. I think you posted online a link, and they're online in that list. And I think it's time that in honoring the men who went from Barbados to World War I, that in Bridgetown, the two lists of men are clearly defined, and that the memorials that are in Bridgetown or at Defense Force or in the cemetery or wherever clearly show the black men who went. We could examine and re-examine their motives, which I've done that type of analysis in thinking about my uncles. And because I was born in 1956 and my father lived to 1989, I did have conversations with him about his brothers. And I would say that it really pained him that they went and what happened to them, and what happened to them when they returned to Barbados. And I'd also like to share that online on FamilySearch.org, you can actually see the surviving records of whether they received their medals and other information. And one of my uncles also went to Egypt. And I think it's very important in honoring the World War I black soldiers from Barbados, men that, even if they were very fair-skinned, they were in the black regiment. So don't let's peeve about how dark they were or how light they were or whatever. They were in the black regiment, and I think it's very important to say that a lot of them never fought. As Mr. Callender said, they cleaned latrines. They cleaned the shoes of the white soldiers. They were treated like scum. And I think that this has to be said. And their lives were always, it was very demeaning. And I think that needs to be shared. And I'm looking forward to see if, I never remember your name, and I hope I say it right, Cox, Hinkson Cox.
Hinkson Cox.
Don't mind if I have it mixed up. I'm really looking forward to seeing a production that addresses the contribution of the black World War I soldiers and what happened to them and what happened to them when they came back here. And I would also like to see this discussed broadly and monuments in Barbados to these men who are descended from enslaved people. So that my question is, Cox,
Hinkson Cox.
Kingston Cox, sorry. Will you move in that direction one day and help create this in a format that young people going forward will be able to identify with World War I from the perspective of not only what happens today and the parade and the this and the that, but linking it right into enslavement. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think the short answer is that I do believe that those are the kinds of narratives that I spoke about, the ones that we don't know, the ones that kind of get silenced. And that is one of the main focuses of the work that I do. So the short answer is I would love to. The realistic answer is after my PhD. So at the moment, any writing that I do is connected to specifically my PhD research. So it's not going to happen just yet, so don't look for it next year. But certainly that is something that I think we would need to explore as one of those lesser known narratives as well.
Okay, Mr.
Thank
Callender, you have a comment?
Yes. Before Mr. Callender makes a comment, I would just like to say there is a very good book written by Professor Glenford Howe, who is a Cotitian historian. Montserratian, I beg your pardon. Montserratian historian, race and identity in politics, the First World War. And it documents the experiences in great detail of Caribbean soldiers, especially Afro-West Indian soldiers, in the First World War, an extensive chapter on the mutiny that took place at Toronto and what provoked it, racism, bad treatment, etc. And it's a very useful must-read for students of the First World War and West Indians. And over to Mr. Callender.
Before you go,
Sorry.
and we can't forget Anthony DeVere Phillips.
Yes.
Go on Barbados. Sorry, go on Great Britain. Barb, this is behind you. You could Google it. Go on Great Britain. Barbados is behind you. And I'm sure you're very familiar with that quotation.
I can really speak the whole night. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
But I want to comment on the last speaker because that's very important. Right here in this museum, you do not have a proper record, and I think it will be corrected. You have raised it, and I hope it will be corrected. As I did mention to you, the same Henry Oscar. And on July the 19th, 1990, there was a big parade in London, and not one of the black soldiers from Barbados or the Caribbean were invited. That's wrong. The second thing, I mentioned Tommy Atkins. I said that deliberately. Thomas, that name came about, I think, somewhere around 1743, where there was a soldier. His name was Thomas Atkins. He was a very brave man. He died on the battlefield, and even in his death, he was still very happy to die for his country. Well, Henry Oscar, or Tommy as they called him, was a man like that. And I would hope that at least show something that he existed somewhere, because he did a lot to hold the name of this, and the mere fact that he was not killed by his commanding officer would tell you the regard he held in. Thank you for raising the issue.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take the final question for the evening. Do we have one?
You have a question? Yep, we've got a question, yes. There we go. Here you go, sir.
Hi. My questions are very short, but they're to three of the panelists. I hope I get this right. Lieutenant Commander Cordell. You mentioned the Norwegian flagship that got sunk ways off the east coast of Barbados?
No, the Norwegian ship was torpedoed in Carlisle Bay.
Oh.
The U-156, the submarine, the German U-boat, was sunk off the east coast.
Okay.
And the ship was called the Betancuria. I think I'm pronouncing
The what?
that. The Betancuria.
Betancuria.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Yes.
Dr. Ward, you mentioned parallels with what we're seeing in the Caribbean now with the story that you were relating. In your experience, any notable points that you think that you haven't mentioned in your speech today that we should be kind of keeping an eye out for?
I think there are a lot of points that you can't mention in 10 minutes. But no, in all seriousness, the most visible one is the expansion of the oil industry in Guyana, the tensions that came about after the infrastructure was put in with Venezuela, and the U.S. deployment to the region, perhaps, obviously don't have all the information, but perhaps to protect American commercial interests and investments in Guyana.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you all very much. I do want to mention, we did the parade this morning down in town at the cenotaph in town. And many people forget that there are cenotaphs in Harrison College and in Lodge School as well. And a lot of people don't remember that. I know the cadets, particularly at Harrison College, normally do a little ceremony the Friday before. But that is also a point to remember, that we just don't have one. Pardon?
Most go like Lodge School and so most of them do. Most schools, they still do the
So Lodge
ceremony.
School still also does the ceremony,
most of them,
right?
they still do it.
Okay. That's what I just said, Harrison College and Law School. Right, okay. So at this point, I want to put out something to the Barbados Museum, having heard our panelists this evening, and being a military person, and also being chairman of the Barbados Legion, where we do have to look after our soldiers who fall on hard times. I would like to see these kinds of discussions and exhibitions before Remembrance Day, so that you can raise the awareness as we go in to the remembrance of our war dead and the remembrance of our current soldiers who are serving. Because many people forget that even though we no longer have the World War veterans and we don't have the World War II veterans, we continue to have wars where Barbadians serve. We continue to have our own Barbadian soldiers who serve and who are at this moment in preparation to deploy to Jamaica to give us assistance. So always remember that even though we don't have our World War I or World War II veterans anymore, they're always being replaced by other veterans. So just always bear that in mind, and we must continue to assist them. I would like to thank our panelists this evening, Dr. Jeffrey Ward, Ms. Michelle Hinkson-Cox, Dr. Cleve Scott, Professor Stefan Mance, Lieutenant Commander Fernella Cardell, and Mr. Pat Canada for being here this evening and giving us such a strong sense of all the things that occurred with World War I and the outcomes from World War I. I would also like the museum to take each of our panelists and do a lecture series with them so that they can expand on the talk that we're giving this evening and not just be limited to 10 minutes. So panelists, I thank you very much for being here this evening. And I want to thank our audience for taking the time to come out and hearing our panelists and learning about World War I. I believe there's still refreshments at the back, so please don't leave the museum with having to go and put them up, but eat them. And during the time that you're enjoying refreshments, maybe we can have the show that Commander Cardell was talking about earlier while you're having your refreshments. Thank you all very much indeed for being here.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for attending. You're a wonderful audience, and thank you again to the panel discussion. I would also like to thank, of course, Colonel Branch, Lieutenant Colonel Branch, for doing such a wonderful job as a moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause for the panelists and Lieutenant Colonel Branch and yourselves. Please remember that the exhibition is open until January 30th, 2026. Tell all of your friends, and please come and see it as frequently as you wish. Thank you. Have a good evening.